first, we'll go according to the sequence in the program. So let me please first invite, I'm Rabea Malik. I'm a senior fellow at Ideas. I'll be presenting today as well. Let me please first invite Dr. Monazza Aslam, who's with Opera, and Dr. Lahore Niaz, who's with the Real Center at Cambridge, to present their paper.
Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you, Rabia, for the introduction. And I am only here to talk about the first slide because my wonderful colleague, Dr. Lahore Niaz, will be doing the presentation. Basically, this is going to be looking at the trade-offs of reaching the most marginalized versus going to scale. Evidence from the Girls' Education Challenge. This is a joint piece of work by myself, Lahore, Professor Pauline Rose, Dr. Shanila Raval, and Emma Sarton. And it's based off a long history of our association with one of the FCDO's biggest education programs focusing on girls globally. And this is, in the last 5 years, I've been the team leader of the independent evaluation of the Girls' Education Challenge, and Lahore has been assisting us in taking part in at least 4 of the studies that we've actually done over the last few years. So yeah, I'll just hand over to Lahore to talk us through this presentation for over 15 minutes. I think that's the time we have. Thank you so much. Thank you. Oh, great. No, you can take time.
Thank you so much, Monazza, for the introduction. If we can go to the next slide. Actually, I'll try from here as well. I can do it from here. So as Monazza mentioned, we'll be talking about whether there's a trade-off between going to scale and reaching the most marginalized. And we'll be using data from the Girls' Education Challenge. So what is the Girls' Education Challenge? Girls' Education Challenge is this massive program that is funded by the FCDO, and it started in 2012. Currently, it's in its second phase, which is just ending, which started in 2017. Now, the aim of the Girls' Education Challenge was to reach the most marginalized girls in 17 country contexts in South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa. This is being conducted through 41 interventions and implementing partners in these 17 country contexts. Now, the second phase of the Girls' Education Challenge has 2 windows. One is called the Girls' Education Challenge Transition. Now, these are projects that started in 2012 and are continuing in the second phase from 2017 onwards as well. And the second phase is called Leave No Girls Behind, that specifically focuses on the most marginalized. Now, what do I mean by the most marginalized? GEC has a huge spectrum of marginalization where they go from no marginalization and disadvantage, which is when a person has access to many opportunities and can realize their full potential, to some marginalization or disadvantage. This would mean that they would have at least one marker of disadvantage or marginalization, which in a lot of contexts would be gender and being a girl and not being allowed to, for instance, go to school or not having the same access and opportunities as boys. Then there is significant marginalization and disadvantage where a person has few opportunities to realize their potential, and up to high marginalization and disadvantage. With the case of high marginalization and disadvantage, it is usually for girls who have dropped out of school or who have never been to school. And this is what the Leave No Girls Behind window of the Girls' Education Challenge focuses on. Before I go on to what we used, our methodology and how we conducted this research, I do want to speak a little bit about what we mean by scale. And I actually want to pose a question to the audience and ask, when I say scale, what is the first thing that comes to your mind? Anyone can say anything.
Don't be shy. As something that operates for at least more than 50% of the population, wherever you might be talking about.
So definitely numbers. We're speaking numbers. That was initially my idea of scaling as well, but the more we did research on it, we thought scaling is not just about reaching targeted numbers, but also about embedding sustainable change in communities, in government systems, so that whatever change is being implemented is sustained on its own as well. So we also use, for the purpose of this paper, the definition of scale that is being used by this other consortium that is being funded by FCDO called the What Works Hub for Global Education. Now, FCDO has in recent times started focusing on a lot of programs that specifically focus on scaling interventions in the global south. So not just having interventions that focus on girls, on marginalized individuals, but also thinking about what is the long-term implication of these interventions and how do you scale them. What Works Hub for Global Education in particular is a global consortium of organizations, and much like the Girls Education Challenge, it includes a number of interventions that are being operated in a range of global south countries, including Pakistan, where 3 different projects are being run. Now, What Works Hub for Global Education defines scaling as the process of maximizing the reach, as Rabia said, and effectiveness of actions to create a long-lasting, sustained impact on outcomes. So in order to do this, they have this framework where they speak about proof of evidence, policy plans, practice at scale, which means what's happening in the classroom, and how all of these connect together to inform scaling. And by scaling, they mean effectiveness, learning at scale. But then our question then is that what is the role of equity in this? What part does equity play in this implementation pathway for scaling? Or where does equity come in? Is there a trade-off? Why is equity not mentioned? And so a lot of our work is focused on how do we make equity a part of scaling, and to consider whether there are any trade-offs in thinking about scale and reaching, having equity and reaching the marginalized. In order to do this, then we focused on data from the Girls Education Challenge. This includes both secondary review of documentation. As Monazza mentioned, FCDO has funded a number of independent evaluation studies to see the effectiveness of the Girls Education Challenge. So we reviewed those independent evaluation studies. There have been a couple of learning briefs from GEC as well to see on various topics, for instance, the learning of girls with disabilities, tackling child marriage, and the value of money. So we looked at those secondary documentation. We also looked at some primary data. So there are 2 new independent evaluation studies that are coming out of the Girls Education Challenge. One of these studies is focusing on the sustainability of interventions, and we used the primary data from that study that had interviews, key informant interviews with project implementers. So there are 41 project implementers in the 17 countries, and we conducted interviews with 20 of those, and we're using the transcripts from those interviews. And the second set of data that we're using is for another study, another independent evaluation study that is focusing on the overall lessons learned from the Girls Education Challenge. And these are interviews with FCDO, with the fund manager, with other stakeholders that were involved in the design of the Girls Education Challenge, to really think about how they were thinking of scale and how they were thinking of reaching the most marginalized. So what did our findings show? Our findings showed that there were definitely difficulties in reaching the most marginalized because there was need for more time and resources. Why was there need for more time and resources? Because girls were facing often intersectional barriers. So for instance, girls with disabilities belonging to ethnic minority communities in Nepal, or girls with disabilities who were displaced, who were in conflict or climate-affected contexts, girls facing early marriages. And a good example of this was prevalent child marriages in one district in Nepal, where access to those girls and their access to education was stifled because of the prevalence of early child marriage. And again, social norms and stigma. And a good example of this was in Sierra Leone, a lot of girls faced teenage pregnancy, especially during COVID, and that hampered their ability to access education. Reaching the most marginalized was also more expensive. The value for money study showed that supporting the most marginalized girls was 2 to 3.5 times costlier than supporting girls who were less marginalized. Girls were also facing severe financial hardships, and they required additional resources. Costs were particularly high for targeting girls with disabilities because of the extra infrastructure and costs that were required to assist those girls. These costs for supporting girls with disabilities were somewhere between 58% to 105% higher than the cost per girl without disabilities. Again, it was costly to reach girls in remote areas as well, those living in areas that are affected by conflict or climate. There was also a problem, an issue where there was a need to have the political will, and sometimes the aim of the Girls' Education Challenge to reach the most marginalized was in conflict with government agendas. There were two prime examples of this. In Kenya, the project implementers wanted to target girls in refugee communities, but there was the refugee camps, the government was constantly trying to shut down the refugee camps in Kenya. The second example, and a very pertinent one, is that of Afghanistan, where there were two projects that aimed to support girls facing intersectional barriers, but their efforts were hindered by the fact that the regime had all of these blanket restrictions on girls' education. And so dealing with those restrictions required more time as well as more resources. But the Girls' Education Challenge also showed us that there were ways of addressing these trade-offs in reaching the most marginalized girls. What were these ways? Firstly, the value for money studies showed us that even high-cost interventions, such as those for girls with disabilities, provided significant value for money. What is value for money? Value for money isn't about cost. Value for money is the benefit that you achieve for the cost, for the money that you spend on interventions. And evidence from the girls' education showed that targeting the most marginalized resulted in quantifiable gains in literacy and numeracy for these girls. A good example of this is CAMFED's program in Tanzania, which delivered especially impressive results. And it showed that for every $100 spent, the benefit accrued was equivalent to 2 years of learning. The Get Value for Money study also highlighted how the benefits overall substantially exceeded the cost. This was 4 to 5 times in Nepal and Ethiopia, and almost double in Malawi. What the Girls' Education Challenge also showed was that interventions targeting the most marginalized did not just benefit the most marginalized girls, but benefited all girls. So when we think of interventions for the most marginalized, we do not have to think in silos. We do not have to think that we spend extra resources and it's only that we'll be reaching 10% or 5%. The interventions for these girls, for instance, in Nepal and Malawi, there were interventions focusing on provision of transport for girls, infrastructure. These interventions helped all girls, not just girls who were more marginalized, such as girls with disabilities. Particularly, there were awareness sessions that were run under the projects that focused on changing community norms. And I know Rabia is going to be presenting a paper on community norms, and I hope this speaks to you. The norms that they were trying to change, for instance, those around having girls with disabilities study, did not just change the norms for the most marginalized girls, but changed the norms for all girls. And this is linked to the next and final point on positive spillover effects. These interventions had intrinsic benefits for the girls, for instance, an increase in aspirations. There were girls in the Girls with Disabilities studies who used to speak about how they had higher aspirations, they wanted to have businesses of their own, they were learning vocational skills, they were earning more money, and now they felt financially independent. These are benefits that you may not be quantifiable, but have a very significant place in a girl's life. The GEC interventions, also the ones targeting the most marginalized girls, also had significant positive spillover effects for boys in terms of, for instance, increase in their awareness, increase in their vocational skills. So the point of all of this is that reaching the most marginalized is also to some extent a moral imperative as well. Our interviews with a lot of the FCDO stakeholders and the fund manager and the external stakeholders showed to us that they spoke about how it was also, when you think of reaching the most marginalized, it's also a policy choice. And it's also a morally correct policy choice. And when you think of it in those terms, yes, it is expensive to reach the most marginalized because they are remote, but that doesn't mean that we shouldn't do it. From a moral perspective, it is the right thing to do. Hence, rather than thinking of it as a trade-off between scaling and reaching the most marginalized, we can think of reaching the most scaling as requiring to start from reaching the most marginalized. So changing our approach and thinking of it not as a trade-off, but and changing the narrative from reaching the marginalized versus scaling to scaling by reaching the marginalized. Because our data shows that scaling and reaching the most marginalized has quantifiable and has significant positive benefits for all girls, for boys. And and those high cost interventions ensures value for money, addresses shared barriers, benefits all learners, and amplifies education equity. And hence, it is important to prioritize the marginalized, but with the viewpoint of thinking that it is not a trade-off, it is not a choice. It is something that needs to be done for all interventions. And so the last point, I showed the framework for the what works for global education in the start. Building on our work, we are now talking to policymakers, we are talking to development partners about how equity needs to be an integral part of the scaling framework. So rather than having just focusing on effectiveness, learning at scale, equity needs to be a pivotal part of this framework. So when we think about efficiency, when we think about scaling, and when we think about effectiveness of learning, we also need to think about equity. We need to think about who are we reaching. It is important to reach the girls, reach the marginalized, but are we reaching the most marginalized? Because that accrues significant benefits. So yeah, thank you. Munazza, do you want to add anything? Okay. I think we're done on time.
Okay, excellent. Thank you so much. So, we have a bigger audience now, so I can announce this. The way the session is set up is we'll have paper presentations and then a discussion about the presentations from the discussants before we move on to the next paper presentation. I'd encourage everybody to please write your questions down as they occur to you for any presentation, because questions hum aakhir mein kholenge. So please do write all of them down. We can call on you later on and we'll collect some questions and then share. So may I please invite Dr. Bilal Malik to please come and discuss the paper.
Hi, everyone. So Rabia and I are...
Sorry, Bilal, are you discussing Monazza's paper?
I'm a little confused. Should we do that at the end? Right now? Okay. So
discussion or फिर आपकी presentation? Or did you...
It's fine to present all three and then potentially, I don't know, it's your call.
because I think the discussion may flow into the Q&A as well. So we'll open it up discussing each other's work, and then we'll open it up for question Q&A.
I didn't introduce Rabia.
Rabia and I are working on a project with Manal, who is sitting right there, and Farooq, who is sitting somewhere else, not in this room. So what we'll do is we'll start with a really brief background and then share some findings from our project. And then we're really also excited to hear the comments that the discussants have and the questions that you may have, because the project is ongoing and I'm sure it'll enrich thinking. So I think, our project is on madrasas, and most people in the audience probably are well aware that these are institutions that provide religious instruction, privately funded, usually through charitable donations, and almost always free for the students who are enrolled in them. But I think there is very little sort of awareness in Pakistan, both in scholarship and certainly in social discourse, is around the stark difference between primary level instruction in madrasas and tertiary level instruction. So this is the image that most people have when they think about madrasas. Young children being taught to read the Quran, sometimes to memorize it, and being taught the rudiments of Islamic practice. These are pictures taken from articles on actually tertiary level madrasas, but the pictures attached are all of sort of young children. Tertiary instruction in madrasas is very different. They take usually students between the ages of 14 to 16 and give them about 7 to 9 years of fairly rigorous Islamic instruction that is focused first on teaching them on how to understand Arabic, and then it moves on to introduce them to fairly dense and advanced texts in Islamic scholarship, in disciplines like fiqh, usulul fiqh, and so on and so forth. So this, for example, is a text you can see. It is not the Quran, and by the end of their madrasa education, students are expected to read and understand this sort of scholarly Islamic discourse. Now, the success rate is highly variable, but that's the goal behind tertiary level madrasa education. Data, very unreliable. So these are various estimates over the last 15 years about madrasa number of institutions and number of enrollments. They are highly variable. I think the main takeaway here is we don't know exactly how many madrasas there are, and we really don't know how many enrollments there are. Tahir Andrabi and Asim Khwaja have a great study that really questions all this data as well and says that their enrollments are actually much lower. I think what we can say is there are some enrollments and some institutions that are probably large enough for us to take them seriously, but we don't. And almost none of the estimates differentiate between primary and tertiary level institutions or enrollments. They just say madrasa, as if like kids campus and LUMS can be lumped together and talked about in the same breath. It's almost ridiculous, but that's what the data is. The most common reform proposed for madrasa since the founding of Pakistan, dating back to the 1950s right up to today, is how important it is to introduce mainstream education in these institutions. And the rationale almost always is that this is for the job prospects of the madrasa graduates and as well as for their social integration in terms of shaping their mindsets. And even though that's been done for more than 70 years now, there's actually almost no empirical evidence about what happens to madrasa graduates once they leave these institutions. Even though we know from research on educational outcomes that they are highly varied by context, geography, the type of education, the gender, demographic subgroup. So you have clear evidence that educational outcomes are context dependent. A long-standing policy imperative to reform madrasa education, and no evidence about what actually happens when these students leave the institutions and enter the labor force. And that's what we have been trying to do in our ongoing research. We look at two institutions, one which really emphasizes the BA as part of its studies, and one that does not. And the reason why we picked these two institutions was we wanted to have a comparison of BA versus non-BA madrasa students in our, and then we also wanted to make sure that our respondents had had some time to settle into the labor market. That's why we did a phone survey of the 2018 cohort from both these institutions. And, you know, there are different slices of the data that we are in the process of analyzing. What we'll share today is based on our data. Is there any association of the BA attainment with labor market and attitudinal outcomes? You know, we understand that this is an associational study and not a causal study, but we think it's still valuable given, you know, the lack of any data about madrasa graduate outcomes. Furthermore, like if we find an association that is at least promising, but I think if we don't find an association between BA and these outcomes, then certainly causation is probably unlikely, and therefore policy needs to really rethink its assumptions. So with that, I'll hand it over to my wonderful colleague, Rabia, and then I'll come back a little bit later.
Thank you, Dr. Bilal. Assalamu alaikum, everybody. So I will be continuing the discussion regarding our sample and the major findings that we have. So our sample is of 228 madrasa graduates, which is roughly split between the two institutions, one that requires a BA degree and the one that does not require a BA degree. In the institution that does require a BA degree, 91% of our respondents reported having a complete BA, Whereas the other institution, only 18% of the respondents have a complete BA degree. We report response rates of 66% and 71%. So I'll first quickly discuss the sample. The 228 respondents, the mean age was 30 years. 79% of them were married at the time of survey. 57% of our total sample had a completed BA degree. 9% of them report a birthplace as a big city, and 98% of the respondents were employed at the time of survey. This table represents some variables which we are used as controls in our regression, control for the socioeconomic class, in order to assess the association of BA with different outcomes. The first of these is education of parents, and the variable is about total years of formal schooling of both the parents. And in our sample, the average is 8.5 years of total schooling for both the parents. Then in order to control for religiosity at home, the variable that we have used is if any of the parent of the respondent has a higher religious education, which is beyond the Nazara Quran. So 21% of our respondents report any parent to have completed a higher religious education. Then to control for the wealth and the socioeconomic class, we constructed a wealth index from a different set of dummy variables, asking respondents about asset ownership when they were 14 to 16 years of age, because that is the time when a student or a young boy is the decision to enroll him into a madrasa is taken. I'll now discuss different outcomes of interest in 3 domains. So first of these is the labor market outcomes. In the labor market outcomes, our first variable of interest is total monthly earnings of graduate in Pakistani rupees. This is the monthly earnings from primary as well as secondary occupations. And we do report an average of 42,200 Pakistani rupees. Then the other variable of interest in labor market outcomes is whether the respondent reports a non-religious primary occupation. 22% of our respondents report a primary occupation which is not religious. In the second domain, which is about attitudes and behaviors related to modern science and technology, we have 4 variables. The first 2, which is the scientific optimism index score and the scientific reservation index score, are taken from the World Values Survey. The third one, which is masking, is a dummy variable which takes a value of 1 if the respondent reports observing masking always, often, or sometimes, as opposed to never or rarely. And the last in this domain is the COVID vaccination dummy, and we do find that 61% of our entire sample of 228 people had taken their COVID-19 vaccine. In the third domain, which is the attitude towards outgroups, we have 3 variables. This is about index of contact quantity, index of contact quality, and intergroup anxiety. And all of these are measured with respect to outgroups, which in this case is university educated people. I'll now report and discuss the findings of our regressions. So in all the tables, we'll follow the same pattern. The first column represents a simple linear regression of BA with our variable of interest. We then add a control for the institution, which is the BHERA, which requires a BA. And the last column adds other relevant controls, which we think are important for our outcome of interest. So for the monthly earnings regression, we do find a positive association between BA and their monthly earnings. However, this is not statistically significant. And as we add other controls, the only statistically significant variables that we find in explaining the monthly earnings are total years of formal schooling of parents and the wealth index of the respondent's family. This table shows the association of BA with whether the respondent reported a non-religious primary occupation, and we do find a positive and statistically significant association of BA with having a non-religious primary occupation, and the result is robust to inclusion of BHERA control and other relevant controls. I'll now discuss findings about attitude towards modern science and technology. Firstly, about the scientific optimism score, we do find that BA is associated with a higher scientific optimism score. However, the results are not statistically significant. Similarly, we do find that BA is associated with lesser scientific reservation, but here again, the results are not statistically significant. For the COVID vaccine dummy, we do find this in the simple regression model, we do find that BA has a positive association with the likelihood of a respondent taking their COVID-19 vaccine, but we lose the significance as we add other relevant controls. Similarly, for the masking behavior, we do observe a positive association between BA and greater likelihood of observing masking. However, we lose significance as we add other controls. Dr. Bilal will now continue with the attitude towards outgroup variables.
So, as Rabia mentioned, the outgroup we defined was essentially you all, which is university-educated people. And again, we found that, the results of the frequency of contact with university-educated people, there was a scale to measure it through in different settings. It was not statistically significant, and it was a little bit ambiguous, in fact, because you can see that BA holders, in our sample at least, report slightly less contact, but not to a significant extent. And again, we measured the quality of this contact irrespective of frequency. And again, in our sample, the results are positive, but not statistically significant. And finally, we also measured the anxiety that students reported. There's a scale for intergroup anxiety. And even though BA holders report less anxiety, again, not to a significant extent. So to sum up, of the 9 variables that we have tested so far in our data set, only one, which is the probability that the person is doing a non-religious primary job, is significant in our data, and all the others are not. And I think one interesting point is that even though our data shows that if you have a BA, you're more likely to do a non-religious vocation. However, this is not associated with a higher pay to a significant extent. So that might be just something for policymakers to think about. So we've reflected a little bit on why we are finding what we are finding, and a couple of quick thoughts on that. One is madrasas are not degree granting institutions. So when these students, not for mainstream degrees. So when these students pursue a BA, or when a madrasa really encourages its students to pursue a BA, they study privately and appear as private candidates. And then on top of that, the subjects they end up taking are very similar to their madrasa studies, naturally, because they want to do well in their BA. So Arabic, Persian, elective Islamic studies, and that might be why we are not finding some associations that we expected to find. The other is that, there is some evidence from Bangladesh that madrasa graduates, even when they have the same qualification as non-madrasa graduates, end up faring poorly in their labor market. And so, there's a possibility that the labor market is discriminating against BA holders who are coming from madrasas. There might be something going on with this social milieu, so that these communities and families have widespread attitudes that do not vary by educational attainment. And that's something that we'll have to reflect. A final comment, we were really a little bit surprised to find out that attitudes towards university-educated people did not vary significantly between BA holders and non-BA holders. And, some thoughts on that. One, we were really surprised to find out that almost half of the students that we surveyed, or the graduates, had siblings with BAs. So that was really interesting. We did not expect that, that there's a high proportion of, brothers who just went into mainstream education up to the BA level. And another thing to think about is that for a non-BA madrasa graduates who go on to, let's say, become Imam Masjid, the nature of that job would require a lot of interaction with university-educated people. So the nature of the religious job, as Masjid Imam or a Qari. So, high exposure to university-educated people in religious jobs, as well as to, university-educated people in their families, may be why BA holders and non-BA holders amongst madrasa graduates don't show a significant difference in their attitude towards outgroups. So I think, just some thoughts for what does this all mean. I think what is very clear is that just this push to have mainstream education in madrasas is not the silver bullet that we have been making it out to be for almost 70 years. We really need to know what type of mainstream education in madrasas would lead to the kinds of positive outcomes that we are interested in. And if there is discrimination in the labor market, then it may not be an intervention amongst madrasa students, but it may be other interventions needed in the rest of society that may be needed for the kinds of outcomes we want. And a final comment that we really need policy discourse that has a sophisticated understanding of the different types of madrasas in terms of levels of education and also elite versus non-elite, urban, rural, and really what's going on in this landscape, which we are currently lacking, which leads to poor policy making. In our data set, there are a whole host of other variables that we are currently in the process, like intergenerational mobility, self-efficacy, spousal characteristics, and then we are slicing the data with another question in mind. Today, we've presented this question of like, is BA attainment associated with certain kinds of outcomes? But another slice of our analysis is to really test some of the assumptions that we have about who studies in madrasas. As we've already shared, these are from families that really value education and have educational opportunities, as you can see from the education of their siblings in our sample. So there's a range of other sort of myths around who studies in madrasas and why that we want to explore, and we've done 40 interviews, and we intend to do some more. We already have 700 more surveys from other students in other cohorts, and we are planning to sort of continue that to increase our sort of sample size. And if we get funding, then we would love to include more institutions. So if any of you have any money, please come talk to us afterwards. So. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ji. I'm Rabea Malik. I'll be talking a little bit today about documenting norms and norm change. And this is findings from a qualitative study that my colleague Tayyiba Tamim and I are involved with. So it's a collaboration between Ideas, LUMS, and our implementing partner, the Citizens Foundation. So I'll talk a little bit about the descriptions and the framing around social norms, linking that to education and life outcomes, the questions that we're doing, some setting and sample that I'll go into the findings and some of the emerging conclusions. So the motivating factor for us when looking at this was that theories of development, whether human development, human capital theory, assumes or predicts connections between education and the kinds of positive outcomes that you might be able to see, social, economic, etc. But in reality, the benefits of education are not often realized. And there's a lot of work that is now happening, which is looking at structural barriers, but also the more informal barriers within which social norms fall, that sort of become these invisible barriers to the realization of individual as well as collective benefits of public investments, public goods investments, education being one of them. So often the norms remain unchallenged and static across generations, but other times there are shifts and patterns in behaviors and life outcomes. So we're really interested in studying in communities where investments in education have been made for a long time, why and how do some norms shift and others don't shift. So this is a study of norm changes, as I mentioned, where long-term investments have happened. These investments have been made by TCF. We're looking at urban communities. Previously, before this organization showed up in some of these communities, there were very few, often dysfunctional schools. And the way these investments were made, if I was to talk a little bit about that, was school construction, but also then operating these schools. So in a very sustainable way, over a number of years, years and decades, growing slowly and surely from, say, primary school to middle school to higher education. So these are not sort of one-off investments. These are not small-scale investments. These are large investments in communities where you end up establishing a service delivery structure that spans a number of years. The main questions that we're trying to get to, so this also sort of relates to the way that I'll talk about the findings as well. So what are some of the intergenerational shifts in norms that we see? So there's been a lot of investment in education in these communities. Which norms have shifted for girls, for boys, and how have they shifted? And then what are the processes? Can we say something about the processes that underlie social change or the continuity of norms as well? So just before I go into the findings, what do we mean by social norms? So essentially, these unspoken, informal rules, what you can do and what you can't do, what you're allowed to do and what you're not allowed to do. क्या लड़कियां पढ़ सकती हैं, क्या वो नहीं पढ़ सकती हैं, क्या वो काम कर सकती हैं, क्या वो नहीं काम कर सकती हैं, अगर बच्ची की शादी होती है तो किस उम्र में होती है या किस उम्र में नहीं होनी चाहिए, etc., things like that. Can girls save? Can they have bank accounts? Should they have cell phones? These rules aren't written anywhere. But these are all conversations that we have quite often. These are all sort of percolating and influencing decisions that individuals and communities collectively are taking. That's really sort of the focus of our study. And these informal rules that underlie and often determine what is acceptable and unacceptable for individuals to do or the ways in which they can be. So they prescribe preferred behavior. So this notion of what a good young man is or what a good young woman is often coming from these kinds of notions of informal norms, right? And they're therefore gendered. But these sort of unspoken rules have a very real influence on what people are able to achieve in their lives, right? So the kinds of decisions that are and opportunities that are available to you and those which you can actually also act on, the goals that you might have for yourself and what you're able to then achieve, and has links with empowerment and agency of women and men. These norms become naturalized over time as tradition and culture. They often normalize unequal power dynamics between men and women and are often evident in patterns of interactions and life choices and life outcomes. And that's why we're able to study them. Despite their deep roots, I wanted to again underline that they are not static. They shift and they can evolve over time. And there's factors that sort of feed into the ways that this happens, which is what we're trying to study. Now, when you look at the literature, there's different kinds of frames or mechanisms that studies from different parts of the world, and of course, qualitative and quantitative studies that are sort of beginning to give us a sense of how norms get transmitted or norms transmission happens. So essentially, intergenerational transmission. जो आपके बाप दादा करते थे, वो आप करते हैं. हमारी community में यही होता है, इस घर में यही होता है, etc., etc., etc. The preferences and aspirations of parents come into this in a big way, but this is this is not an uncomplicated sort of mechanism, because you can have aspirations that disrupt negative norms as well, right? So you can have that one parent in a community who wants something different for their children, etc., etc. And then when that number of parents grows to a point is when you see a tipping point or perhaps a shift in norms. So norms are learned through observation. They're maintained through fear and censure, but also through rewards, right? So the reason norms have a hold is because you fear what other people are going to say, or you value the rewards that will come from particular types of decision or particular types of practices. And they're imposed either through vetoing decisions or support of them. So reference groups, and social network dynamics then become really important, right? So who is it that you fear censure from? which will keep you from taking certain decisions. And this may be your family, this may be your community, but also social networks are such that they might evolve over time, right? So you see people migrating either from the rural areas to the urban areas, you see people leaving their countries, going abroad. So the social networks that they have, some might remain the same, some might change. But censure from the reference group and whether or not it changes becomes important for the study of the ways in which norms get transmitted or get disrupted. Similarly, rewards for prescribed and appropriate behaviors and practices. Another way or another mechanism in which norms may change is the individuals themselves. Someone with enough agency to say, this is my goal, I wish to do this, and I'm going to do it. So the role of personal agency and empowerment really comes into it. So to very quickly, may I do a chime check, please? Yes, okay, good. So when thinking about if studying norms and their influences on individual choices and outcomes, there's a number of things that you have to take into account. So you may have to think about what the community believes and their expectations, the family aspirations and beliefs and expectations, the individual's own beliefs and expectations, and then, of course, influences, the big influences. So if families and communities are big influences, so are schools and teachers. So the ways in which these different sort of constructs are connected to each other, but also to individual actions and choices is something that we try to frame within this study. It naturally goes into, when you're talking about decisions and agency, etc., sort of we naturally, when we look at life outcomes for these individuals, we've tried to employ the capability theory, but also these 6 dimensions. So the economic, the social, political, physical, and psychological. So in these dimensions of capability, what do the communities believe? What do the families believe? What does the individual themselves believe? And what are they able to achieve? But today I'll only talk about what the individuals are able to, the norms around education, the norms around works and savings, and around marriage and fertility decisions. So to go into a little bit into the sample, this is 8 urban communities in provinces of Punjab and Sindh, and roughly around 120 interviews with people who graduated 10 to 12 years of education. We speak to their parents also. We speak to some dropouts as well. We wanted some comparison. Within this system, there were fewer dropouts, and we speak to teachers and head teachers. And just to give you a sense, we were in Sargodha and Rawalpindi, Khanewal and Chang in Punjab, and communities in Karachi and Hala in Sindh. So what are the intergenerational shifts that we see? So the biggest shifts we see are around education. So earlier generations did not, earlier generations did not believe that education had utility for people like us. So they did not necessarily believe that education mattered. And now across generations, and you can see this, so we asked the parents about what their parents believed. We ask them about what they believe about their children. We ask the children themselves about the parents and their own children, right? So you sort of get this narrative of why the mothers in our sample were not educated versus what they wanted for their daughters. And you get this sense of, and this is not a new finding, but there's a huge demand for education and there's a huge value for girls' education, right? So the girls are now enrolling in these communities, the girls are enrolling and staying in school longer. So what we find is the debate is no longer about whether a girl should go to school or not. That's not the conversation around norms. The conversation is, kaun se subject padhe? Should it be science? Should it be economics? Should it be something else, arts, etc.? So it's about what they should be doing, whether they should go to college, whether they should stay in the same city or go to another city. Fathers in our sample emerge as real big champions of girls' education. So around girls' education, we're seeing a new generation of norms. So we're almost in a second generation of norms with high investments in education, particularly for girls, reflecting shifts in beliefs as well as in reference groups, we think, right? Around boys' education, we see very, very interesting shifts in norms as well. It's not that the demand for boys' education has gone down, or that people say that boys shouldn't be going to school, but there's a disengagement for boys from mainstream education. They don't see it. Some of it is external in terms of shocks that they receive, which force them to drop out of school and start earning early. And some of it is just not seeing what staying in school longer is going to give them in terms of benefits in the labor market. So they're dropping out earlier and earlier. But also what was interesting when speaking to the communities about what they believed, there seems to be this normalization that boys are like this, that boys they're not interested in studying. So it's okay for them to go and work. And it's okay. So there isn't necessarily a huge push, or this is not a worry. So there are boys who are dropping out, and this is sort of an emerging finding. So we hope to work with our partners as well as in our future research. We want to dig into this deeper a little bit, understand what's happening, what the scale of it might be, because ours, of course, is a qualitative study, but I think this is sort of hit on something interesting when we're talking about boys, because it sort of gets taken for granted that masla education ka sirf bachchiyon ka hai, which is the case. There's huge challenges. But I think there's something happening with boys' education that we really do need to sort of pay attention to, just even in mainstream education. There's a very instrumental approach to education as well, and its values, particularly for boys. They're looking, when you talk to them, they're only talking about sort of wages and the kinds of jobs that they might be able to get. There's an apparent unwillingness to make individual investments, to quickly go into the job market, etc. So to quickly jump into norms around women's work, more and more women are working in these communities, which are urban communities, but they're semi-urban communities. The women from a younger generation are engaged in paid work rather than unpaid work, outside the house rather than simply inside the house. So while the norms around women working are changing, it's more slow than the norms around education. And there's very strong norms around what's appropriate and inappropriate for women to do. So teaching is fine, but you can't work in a bank. Another kind of job is fine, healthcare is fine, but you can't work as a salesperson, that sort of thing. So while some norms are shifting, there's still quite strong opinions or social conversations around what they can do and can't do. Alongside that, we find that work might be happening and they might be moving into the labor force, but the gendered roles at home haven't changed. But the gendered roles for the boys have also not changed. A successful boy is still somebody who's able to earn the living, and that's their primary role. The women are working a lot more, but they also, thank you, but they also have to, they also have to be good homemakers at the same time. The other really important thing in conversation that we found out, is demand for education and demand for jobs isn't necessarily linked. So one of the big reasons why women say they're working more is because of the economic stress. So since COVID, health shocks, economic shocks, other shocks, it is no longer possible for couples, and they talk about this quite openly, for a family to have just one source of income. You need more sources of income, which means the educated women who are sitting at home are able to provide that to their families. What's interesting is this has implications for investments in education, right? And they might not have set out to change norms for women's work, but it sort of precipitated that. With financial services, more women have bank accounts. This is linked a little bit to them having salary accounts, bank accounts where their salaries come into. Women believe it's important for them to save for themselves. And now, sort of from traditional forms of savings, there's a shift to more modern forms of savings, but it's not like women have not saved. They've always saved. It's just that we're seeing more access to mainstream financial services now. More and more young people, so the marriage age has shifted. It used to be much younger. Now young girls are getting married later, but this is something that's happening nationally. So we took a quick look at the demographic health survey. So it's not just in this community, but elsewhere as well. Around domestic violence, you might see there's still a presence. People are not talking so much about it, but there's some evidence to suggest that educated women are believed to be less exposed. So these are just some emerging findings. So just very quickly to talk about processes that underlie norm change. The creation and operation of schools that are safe spaces for girls. So these gendered investments in public goods provision, or we are arguing, become a precursor for individual and collective behavior change, right? So again, as I mentioned, TCF may not have set out to take on norms. That's not their mission. That's not what they're doing. They're providing education. But creating this ecosystem has allowed those few parents who had the aspirations for their girls to go to school, for other parents to see them. So one, they were able to achieve those aspirations. When other parents saw them, slowly, gradually over time, it just became normal for girls to be going to school in these communities. And that's really how the shift has happened, right? So slow, gradual sort of change. Secondly, education changes the capabilities and the aspirations, of course, of the individuals themselves. So how you're able to negotiate for yourself, what you're able to ask for yourself, etc., the kinds of opportunities you're able to avail sort of changes. So as I mentioned, when economic shocks hit, there were women who were educated who could benefit from the opportunities that arose in those communities to take up the jobs, right? So the acquisition of knowledge abilities provides these boys with the self-confidence and communication skills. They're able to articulate their own position. They're able to imagine different futures. But the investments that have been made then allow them to benefit in that way. The other really big factor, structural factor that stands out for us is economic uncertainty. So there are two shifts that happened. Local schools started hiring local teachers, which made a lot of jobs available, thank you, which made a lot of jobs available for the young women in these communities, and these happened to be then the acceptable jobs. So they were, suddenly they started working and it became fine, it just became normal, right? And the head teachers, were part of the community, maintained communication with the community. This organization had a really good reputation in the community. So women's work in certain kinds of jobs just made it normal for women to be working. So investments in education service delivery and the demand for local teachers is one thing. And like I mentioned already, it's no longer possible for a family to survive. So that's just pushed for stuff to happen. If those were the structural factors or macro factors, which individuals themselves are not necessarily changing, there are sociological processes at the micro level which we think also kind of show us what happens and why certain norms begin to change. So as information spreads, as knowledge and observations of new shifting beliefs, role models. So the teachers who graduated from these schools become the role models not just for the girls, but also for the boys. So as the boys begin to go to other schools or other colleges, they begin to see, oh, my sister can do this too. My cousin can do this too. They can teach, they can work, they can go to other cities and study. So the role of role models, again, is emerging as a really important thing. With more education and as you start to work, your reference groups begin to change as well. If you were only completely reliant on one family or one closed reference groups, that might begin to open. Your sources of information about what's possible in terms of government programs instead of your own rights, et cetera, become sort of expanded, which allow you to then sort of make decisions that are different or not worry about censures and not look so much for rewards. The shifts in parental preferences is that very high demands continued investment. So just to conclude, G, like I've already spoken, the biggest shifts we see in norms are with regards to education, slowly shifting norms with regards to women work. There's sticky norms and some that are less sticky, but it appears that there's two sets of things that work together. So you have structural macro factors, which yes, some of policy can think about. So investments in public goods and how you do them should come regardless of the numbers that may or high demand, right? Knowing that to begin with, and that may lead to positive and connected spillovers. But then also some economic stress and uncertainty. But then there are intergenerational transmissions and changes in preferences, which are happening on a micro level, and the two seem to work together somehow to create norm change. I'll stop here. Thank you very much. Yeah, I'll just take a quick second. Should we move on to one of our first discussants? So would you like to discuss Monazza's paper from
Yeah, I loved it. We want to have some time for Q&A. And I had a bunch of questions, so I'll just ask just one of my questions, and the rest could come from the audience. But I found it interesting how you ended things on this question of morality. I just want to play a little bit of a devil's advocate for you, just to enable you to flesh out your position a little bit more. So you said that it's a moral imperative for us to really make this investment in marginalized people and communities, even though it may be a higher cost investment. So I think just to push you a little bit on that, the alternate is also can be framed as a moral imperative. So just to think it through, if I have only 100 rupees and no more, because policy is, with constraints, right? We have time, effort, and many constraints. So if I have 100 rupees and I can use that to give one more year schooling to, let's say, a blind poor girl, and the same amount of money to give 1 year of schooling to 2 or 3 poor girls who are not blind. Now, I know you ended with like it's moral imperative, but if one could argue that it's also it could be a moral imperative to reallocate resources, because the personal benefit to the non-blind poor girls will be more. They will be able to do more with their education, and the spillover effects in their families and communities will be more. So how would you sort of say that no, don't educate the poor non-blind girls, because there's limited money, right? And with unlimited money, you can do everything. But instead, we still say that the moral imperative is to put that 100 rupees to the blind poor.
Thank you so much. That's an excellent question, and I think this is something I think Lareb will also come to. I think the reason why we put that particular slide in is because and that's why we asked that question about when you think about scale, what is the first thing that comes to mind? And when governments and decisions are being made by policymakers about reaching more people, we just want to make sure that it's remembered that the marginalized are not forgotten. And what you're talking about is extremely important, because that was another question we posed about whether it's the marginalized or the most marginalized, the blind, very poor girl versus the girl who's just very poor, right? So I think these are very philosophical questions, and I don't think we have easy answers for them. I think the overarching, if I want to leave everyone in this room with one thing, it's to think about that when we think about scale and reaching, it's very good to think about scale and reaching more people, but it's very important to also remember that in reaching more people, you may actually be forgetting the most marginalized and the marginalized. And I think that's the only thing we want to think about, that there's often there can be a resource-wise trade-off, but I think from the perspective of thinking about a longer-term solution, yes, reach more people, but at the same time, don't forget the most marginalized and the marginalized. And if you have the opportunity, do remember to reach them, because I think this is the biggest lesson from the Girls' Education Challenge, where there are huge debates. And if you look at the resources we have, huge numbers of resources where, the amount that was spent in reaching some of the most marginalized was huge. It was a huge amount of money that was spent. And FCDO was like, what is happening here? Like, you're spending so much. But when you look at the impact it had within communities and how things changed, that impact provided a justification for that spend. But I think that's I don't think we can answer that question, and you know it. But the thing is that it's an important question for us to bear in mind and take forward.
I do think that's a great question, and it's something that we have been grappling with as well. But I do think that the data from the Girls' Education Challenge shows that you don't necessarily need to think of it as diverting resources, because it was possible to target the most marginalized. And you gave a very specific example. In that case, yes, it's a big question. Do you help 3 girls or do you help 1 girl? But in the case of larger interventions, it is possible that you target the most marginalized by having, system level interventions, individual level interventions, and then that can help the larger population as well, right? So you can reach a larger population by targeting the 10%. It is possible that you do interventions such as, accessible wash facilities, such as ramps in schools, such as transport facilities that would help the 50% as well. So it is possible to think of it in that way rather than thinking of there is competition between the two.
I think you just threw it back at me. That, I think what I hear you say, and I'll stop and we can move on to other discussions, that, I'm framing it as a dichotomy, but you're saying that the 100 rupees that you spend on the blind poor girl will also help the non-blind poor girls, and that's the contention there. Fair point. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So one question then, G. So I think it was a great idea, Bilal, to just sort of meld the discussions and questions. So I'll ask the both of you a question, and then perhaps Monazza and Lareb have one for me, and then we'll open up to the audience. So it was absolutely fascinating to hear your work, and you're very, very right that this is some of the rare work, not just in higher education, but on madrasa. So all the distinctions and nuances are fantastic. I'll pick up on 2 points. One of them is around one of the conclusions that you also bring out, which is that should we be thinking about different types of education or degrees? And within that, are you thinking about vocational at all? So I understand this is linked to a mainstream policy push, which is why it's a very relevant question to ask. But beyond that, in your own thinking, how are you thinking about different types of education also, I guess, and how that might benefit or how it plays out in this setting in terms of mainstreaming? And my other question was going to be around attitudes. So fantastic, because we often don't hear about attitudes to science, and so that's really great. But are you also looking at attitudes to sort of more regular things like citizenship or gender relations or that sort of thing? I'll stop here.
So, I mean, I think these are very easy questions, because I can say we are not thinking about that. I think our interest in exploring madrasa education is our hope is to enrich the discourse and thinking about madrasa education, and we are not the thrust of our work is not to actually sort of legitimize the kind of discourse that's been happening around madrasas and to enable it further. So, for example, this question about employability and vocational training of madrasa people, I think I would contend that this entire discourse ignores the fact that madrasa education is education, and in fact, it's specialized vocational education. Right. So when you saw the labor market outcomes of at least tertiary level madrasas, you saw that even the madrasa graduates who went into non-religious jobs were not earning significantly higher than the madrasa graduates who were pursuing religious jobs, which begs the question, there are religious jobs in our society. So I think my hope for the future of this discourse would be that we start talking seriously about the religious labor market sector and then we connect that with the religious education sector. So the entire conversation around madrasas is how to make them more employable in the non-religious sector, which is to me as absurd as saying that for 70 years, let's talk about medical schools and let's talk about how to make medical education better so that they can serve as, I don't know, shoemakers. Yeah. I mean, the conversation around medical school improvement should be about how to improve medical education so they can be better doctors, right? And nobody is talking about how to improve madrasa education, which is specialized vocational training for a certain type of role in our society, how to improve it for that role, right? So anyway, so in our, so in our research, we are not thinking about how to introduce sort of vocational training because we feel they're already getting vocational training, and we would hope that that vocational training itself can become better.
Absolutely fantastic. Please frame it that. Yeah. Is it possible, whilst we're on your study, is it possible to ask a very, and I think you had a question as well, sorry, and then I'll discuss your paper and then. So I was just because this was really nicely structured into this whole discussion around norms and, attitudes and, made me think when you were talking about madrasas and you were talking about the fact that, graduates with a BA degree versus those with a non-BA degree did not see different outcomes in the labor market. I was also thinking, have you thought of the fact that madrasas themselves might be little silos which have specific social norms and attitudes? So when you think of a madrasa as an institution, they are also kind of like in some ways different because they are providing a certain kind of education, but also a certain kind of environment, right? So when we think about it like that, is that also contributing to the ultimately, I mean, I'm thinking about, have you thought of that as a possibility and have you thought of measuring that as well? So as little institutions with their own social norms that are kind of sticky.
So that's a really both great questions. So I think what my work makes me believe actually that it's not that madrasas are these isolated sort of cultural communities that are insulated, but rather the elites who study them are isolated social communities that are really disconnected from the rest of the country. And in fact, madrasa teachers and their students and graduates are far more representative of and embedded in the communities in which they inhabit. And that is why the sort of like the academic discourse, which is sort of from these elite spaces, routinely has been trying to sort of reduce the influence numbers, and yet it is charitable donations from the rest of the country that has sustained these institutions through sort of very targeted colonial policies that were meant to sort of really eradicate them. And then subsequently post-colonial sort of, elite-led policies that have continued to sort of reduce their funding, reduce their influence, reduce their enrollments. And it is the rest of the country that has sustained them so successfully over the last 200 years of this onslaught. So I find that actually when you talk to sort of these communities that are sending their students to madrasa, there is these are sort of, regular, these are not conservative Muslim families. These are regular sort of community members who attach a high premium to piety and pious living. And then they really want one of their child to be sort of like the fount of piety in their family. And so they send one of their children to sort of, they really encourage one of their children to think about it. Think about it. And when we talked to a lot of students about, why they ended up in the madrasa, and it's really, it seems to be like a very prevalent social norm in this social milieu, that they will say that, look, so and so's son is studying at a madrasa. Why don't you think about it? So they really are beginning to encourage one of their sons to really, think about it, because it's really rigorous. It's much harder than public school. It's very regimented. Like, you wake up at Fajr and you do wuzu with cold water, and then you have a very regimented sort of study schedule all the way to Asr, and then you might get some free time. And so it's really, I think those are my thinking around sort of social norms and madrasa communities.
It's the most laid back I've ever been as a convener, but as a chair. But if I may, so if we hold off on the question for me and open up to the audience. So you've got 1 question, 2 question, 3 question. Let's take 3 first, please.
My question is for you.
For me.
Yeah. I'll preface this. I don't intend to antagonize or undermine your thesis. But there was something that you said in your presentation that's incorrect. You said the question of what women should do as it pertains to work, what they should not do, these are unspoken norms. They are not written anywhere. That is not correct, ma'am.
It's written in the Quran.
No, it's not. It's in Sahih al-Bukhari.
Acha.
I can tell you exactly what it is, but I don't want to.
Okay. ठीक है. So ये आपका सवाल है, comment है?
It's a remark.
Achha.
And it is in. See, this is an Islamic state.
ठीक.
And every Islamic state has a constitutional faith.
ठीक.
That's Hanafi.
ठीक.
And in the Hanafi school, the most authoritative body after the Quran is Sahih al-Bukhari.
Okay.
Those norms are generated from Hadith 7099 in Bukhari.
Okay,
And that's
so that's,
moving our business.
so your comment. Thank you. G, please. Are you sure? Do you need a mic? I do.
I don't
Okay.
So I just wanted to ask for clarification. Please correct me if I'm wrong. You have been speaking in this presentation about madrasas, their function as an educational institute, right? Now, as far as, can everyone hear me?
No, I think they need it for the recording.
Oh, okay. So you've been talking about madrasas and their primary function as an educational institute. As far as my anecdotal understanding, I've not researched madrasas, so please remind me if I'm wrong. It seems to me their primary function is actually not as educational institutes, but as kind of this informal social welfare system, right? So madrasas, for a lot of the children who are there, are a way to have a roof over their head and have their stomach full. It is also doubles as a social welfare system. And as far as I understand, most of the people, most of the population of the children enrolled in madrasas are not privileged. They are not like the kids who go to LUMS, right? So I just wanted to ask, am I wrong about that? That their primary function is not just educational institutes, but also as an informal social welfare program? Like, they have food stamps and such things in America, and that is kind of our local version of that. It's essentially a way for a child to have their basic needs, roti, kapda, makan, kind of met. I would love to have some clarification on that.
So I'm also comfortable without mic, but perfect.
Needed for the recording.
Okay, perfectly fine. So again, Jamshed Zaman from Global Research Trends. My question from Dr. Bilal. Sir, I'm asking this question where the registration bill of madrasa is on the door of president. And again, I really want to ask, as one of our fellow again mentioned, this is for the pure welfare, social welfare purpose of the society. So what I'm asking is that still possible if we are still thinking to assure the quality social and educational standards of the madrasa, where before this bill, which is going to be passed in the parliament with the stress, with a kind of a certain pressure from a specific community or social or political society or a social or political party in the country. And again, I also want to ask, would it be possible to talk about these all aspects which we are discussing over here? And is it still our priority? While if we look into the practical domains of Pakistan, so do we still think about that? Thank you so much.
Take one more question.
anyone from the honorable panelists can answer. Ma'am, from the feministic perspective in education, I think that we have overly emphasized on girls' education, and now we are observing the crisis of masculinity. For example, in our society, and I think 2012, Hannah Rosen, a professor at New York University, wrote a very wonderful book, The End of Men and the Rise of Women. And she quotes, for every 2 men in the United States, for example, who will receive a BA degree this year, and 3 women will do the same. And now in our Punjab University, for example, I am coming, women are outperforming men. The College of Information Technology are seeing more application for the programs of information technology, software engineering from women as compared to men. Because we are observing a change in our job landscape, you know. So I think, shouldn't we begin to talk about men now?
So that's the question. Bilal, 2 questions to you. Thank you for the comment. So I'll definitely consider it. I'll think about how that works into the framework of norms and how we're theorizing it. So thank you for the comment. Okay, thank you. So aap ke jawab de de, and then we come to this side.
You know, the government has been trying to register madrasas. There is nothing new about what the current bill. It's been going on for decades. And it's been almost never successful. So I don't think it will be particularly successful this time around. About your question, I think the data doesn't support this very common assumption that the reason why people go to madrasas is because it's for welfare reasons. I think this is a myth born out of a confusion for those who are trying to figure out why would anybody go to a madrasa. So I think if you start with the assumption that it's absurd that anybody would want to go to a madrasa, then you start looking for, well, there must be something else, right? It must be free food, it must be free shelter. When the answer, in fact, I mean, there's several studies that have shown that the most common reason why children end up in madrasas is sort of the pietistic aspirations of their parents. There's research in Pakistan that shows that. Asim Khwaja and Tahir Andrabi had a study on madrasa, well, not on just madrasas, but they do work in education, and they showed that, the first, in their research also, similar to ours, they found that madrasa going children had siblings in public or private schools. Vast majority, I forget the exact number, but I think 75% of the madrasa students had siblings in public or private schools. So the way they posed it was that, parents first think, should I send my child to a school or not? That's the first question. And once they are like, no, my child should be in school, then they start thinking which school. And then there's a little bit of a portfolio approach. That one they may send to a madrasa for pietistic reasons, one they may send to public or private school. So I think it is true that madrasas, because they are able to generate charitable donations, are able to provide a lot of things to their students. However, I think that the demand for religious education in Pakistan is real. I think people have a pietistic sort of sentiments and aspirations, and madrasa enrollments are a larger result of that than sort of free food or free shelter.
Can I just add a comment?
Yeah, so Manal is one of our co-researchers. Yeah,
I'm working on a paper with Dr. Bilal. So I just, I wanted to sort of address that. I think you mentioned that what you're saying is sort of anecdotal. And so I think that is what we are trying to address as well in our research, because a lot of the present prevalent sort of a discourse on madrasas is anecdotal, and that's why we are also sort of challenging the policy assumptions. Like we have, since partition, I think we have policies that are not really based on anything empirically backed. And so that is why we're here and we're doing our research. And I would suggest that you also, if you really want to like look deeply into this, you could look at this great study by Anne Cockcroft and a lot of other authors in 2009. I think it was in the International Journal of Educational Development. It's called Challenging the Myth About Madaris in Pakistan. And it's like based on National Household Survey or something like that. So I did a lot of lit review. So some of these are just burned in the back of my brain. So I mean, I think you could definitely look at that, and that really addresses this. I remember this being one of the myths that, oh, people just think. Sorry. Yeah, yeah. I think I can like.
There's just one comment I wanted to make about this question. So, regarding our data, we find parents with reasonable asset ownership regarding commercial property, residential property. So, it's not really that they are the extremely poor segment of the families which are sending their kids to madrasas.
I'll just respond on the final question. I'll take 2 seconds. Coming to the boys versus the girls debate, I suggest you read the work that has come out by David Evans and all that are kind of saying exactly what you're saying and looking at the different kinds of girls' interventions. But I think the biggest issue I have with what you've said is that it's the same thing as saying is that private schools versus government schools. You see, when you look at something like private schools, you're talking about, it's not like homogenous. It's what does private school actually mean, right? It's the same thing about girls' education. Even in the context of Pakistan, a girl in Lahore is very different, for example, from a girl in Balochistan. I'll just give you that as an example to say that, you know, girls are outperforming, yes, in urban centers, in many parts of Pakistan as well. Just take Pakistan as an example, but many parts of the country, we don't even have girls accessing schools. So, you know, you can't just say girls' education has changed this discussion. So I think your point is valid, and I recommend that you do look at some of the literature. But when you think about girls' education, I would also suggest that you don't think of all girls as being equal. And I thought that was the point of our presentation. Thank you.
Can we take a couple of questions from this side of the room and then your questions for me, actually?
I can talk to you over to your paper was amazing.
Perfect. जी यहाँ पे सवालात होंगे. जी please. आप लोगों को mic देगा? They need it for recording. So जी, we have 5 more minutes, so please your questions.
Hello, thank you. Mohammed Abdullah Khan from the Civil Services Academy. I'm from the police service. So my question is for Dr. Bilal. When we speak of the policy objectives, like in the start you mentioned, I believe, that when these policies were first introduced, the paper was relatively focused on assessing the effect of BA education or BA attainment towards achievements in the labor force. But as far as my understanding with regards to this topic is concerned, since I was studying the National Action Plan recently as well, the policy objective sort of shifted after 2014, where the main objective was not the labor force integration, but the social integration part of the madrasa students. For instance, I believe, and I think there might be some aspect where I missed, but if you could please comment on whether the study looked into the effects, like you spoke of, the effects or on the quality and the quantity of contact with university students. But I would have loved to maybe seen the impact it had on like social norms, like the attitude towards girls, attitude towards female education or GBV, or attitude towards other social issues such as extremism, which is a key factor when we speak of madrasas. So if you could please share your views on that, that would be very
Any other questions?
highly appreciated.
Dr. Habib.
Thank you. I enjoyed all of the papers, but since there isn't a lot of time, I just want to pick up on the last question. When you, Dr. Bilal, mentioned that the funding is from local charities and sort of meeting the demands of parents who, would like their children to be in this environment and, reflecting their desires for the pious aspect of the education, are they afraid that their children might get radicalized in some situations? Because we, I don't know a lot about this, but one, in the news, etc., all the outside funding problem that one reads about, but one doesn't really know what is actually going on. But is there an element of kind of, a fear that there might be some extremism, aspects of extremism or radicalization that might be going on that obviously parents probably wouldn't want their children to, get into that aspect of the madrasa education? So just picking up a little bit of what was mentioned.
So briefly, I can answer those, and if Rabia, you have anything to add, you can do that. We had to reduce our survey instrument. We started off with a 2-hour-long survey, and then even with breaks, people get exhausted. And so when we piloted it, we had to keep bringing it down and down and down to under an hour. So in the end, we end up with a set of outcomes that we really wanted to measure, and we had to leave out other outcomes. Nevertheless, there are certain parts of the data that we want to look at moving forward. So we do ask about their aspirations for their children's education. And one of the things we would like to look at in the future is whether the aspirations differ by those who have BA and those who don't. We also have data on spousal characteristics, whether their wives are, how qualified, what education their wives have, and what they're doing, whether they're working or whether they're not working, and we can look at that. So yes, I mean, so there's some other elements of the data that will allow us to get to some of these questions, but the element about social integration that our survey doesn't cover is actually around, we looked at outgroups as a university educated people, but the real outgroup are sectarian others. And that's something that our survey instrument doesn't look at. It's not even like, I think, non-religious, other religions are less of an outgroup. And it's a whole separate conversation about why actually it ends up being that in tertiary madrasa education, who are producing imams and qaris, the most closely aligned sect is often the most discussed. So it's almost like, an economist doesn't spend a lot of time thinking about an anthropologist. They're probably spending the most amount of time discussing, that strand of economics that they think is just wrong. So I think, Deobandi and Barelvi are both Hanafi, Sunni, Muqallid sort of sects. They're the closest, but they discuss each other the most. And that would be interesting to see, which our study doesn't do. There was another question. Around radicalization. So no, I think the evidence does not support the relationship between sort of madrasas and radicalization, and that has been proven over and over and over again. So, for example, Christine Fair has looked at who are the terrorists and suicide bombers in Pakistan, and they are non-madrasa affiliates. So, I think there's, again, an assumed link between violence and religious affiliation amongst those who maybe are not familiar with that religious affiliation. So it becomes an explanatory variable because we're trying to explain some crazy behavior, and then we say, well, I'm not particularly religious and these people are religious, so that must be why. But actually, madrasas graduates are producing, a more committed and knowledgeable version of the piety that's widely prevalent in their homes and communities anyway. These madrasas or tertiary level madrasa graduates, these Darse-Nizami graduates, they're just like considered more knowledgeable and practicing of the norms that others are lax about, but nevertheless committed to. So that's, I think, the primary difference. And that's the hope of the parents, that, when you graduate from the madrasa, like, you will be who we all should be. And you will also, sort of tell us what we should and should not do, and you will represent the best of us in your sort of daily practice. But I think it would be interesting to see there is a radicalization of even mainstream sort of, or politicization, I should say, not radicalization, but, Barelvis were usually not that political, but over the last decade, they've become more and more sort of politically involved, but not violent. I mean, I think violence remains a very sort of marginal concern because so few are actually involved. And a lot of them are just running families as masjid imam and, just thinking about their kids' education and so on and so forth. At least that's our findings. So.
Thank you so much. There's a report from the World Bank on norms, and they've used the World Survey, but that's completely quantitative. And actually you might find some of their studies, South Asia, not just Pakistan, not as progressive as you might expect. So what you're saying about less distance between regular in attitudes and opinions and those in madrasas, maybe, and that's like a wonderful, to me, there's fewer differences than we perceive there to be. It falls on me to thank my panelists and to let you know that lunch is at PDC. Aap logon ke liye lunch is at EDH Lawn because you did the work on the presentations. Thank you so very much. Please continue your questions if you have any. Thank you.